Hello everyone, welcome to Storytime. My name is Gretel and I'm so excited to be visiting you here at the library, even though I can't be physically here with you. But I thought we'd read some fun fairy tales today, including one of my own favorite, which happens to be Hansel and Gretel, the story about my brother and I. So I thought we'd read some other fairy tales that have to do with siblings and some other fun things that my friends have read to me. So let's get started. Okay, this is Hansel and Gretel, and this adaptation is done by Will Moses. This was originally written by the Brothers Grimm, but was originally lived by me. Long ago, there lived a woodcutter, his wife, and his children, Hansel and Gretel. The woodcutter's family lived in a little cottage near the edge of an ancient and mysterious forest. And it is in this mysterious old forest that this tale takes place. So beautiful. My story begins late one moonlit night, while wolves howled nearby and the woodcutter's family lay in their beds, hungry and unable to sleep. The woodcutter suddenly turned to his wife. "Oh, wife, what is to become of us?" he asked. "How can we feed our poor children when we barely have enough for ourselves?" "I'll tell you what I think," his wife, who was the stepmother of the two children, said cruelly. "Tomorrow morning we'll take Hansel and Gretel with us into the forest, the darkest part. We'll build them a fire and give them one last piece of bread. Then you and I will pretend to do our work as always, but instead we will leave the children there alone for good." "Oh no," said the woodcutter, who loved his children. "We can never do such a thing. Wild animals will find them, and that will be their end." "You fool," his wife said hotly, her eyes flashing. "It is either that or all of us will certainly perish. You may as well start making all our coffins in the morning." Still, the woodcutter would not agree, but his wife harangued and argued until, worn down, he gave in and agreed to the horrible deed. Luckily, the two children were also hungry and unable to sleep that night, and overheard the dark plan. Poor Gretel wept a tide of bitter tears and cried to Hansel, "I fear it is all over for us, Hansel." "Shh, and be still, little sister," whispered Hansel. "I will find a way to save us. You must not worry. Now please try to sleep." And here's our house in the forest. So beautifully illustrated. A little later, when the woodcutter and his wife finally dozed off, brave little Hansel quietly slipped out of the cottage door and, in the light of the moon, filled his pockets with the shiny white pebbles that twinkled brightly in the moon glow. Then, quick as a wink, Hansel was back in his bed, but before sleep overtook him, he whispered, "Sleep in peace, my little sister. All will be well." At sunrise, our stepmother shouted, "Wake up, you lazy bones! Today we all go to the forest again." She gave each child a piece of hard bread and said, "Here is your noonday meal. Save it, because there is nothing else." Gretel put the bread in her apron pockets, since Hansel's pockets were filled with pebbles. Before long, the little group was well on its way to the forest, but after some distance, Hansel stopped to look back and secretly dropped a pebble. This he did again and again, until the cruel stepmother growled at him. "Hansel, what are you doing?" "Oh, I am looking at my little white cat, who is sitting on our roof and wants to say goodbye to me." "You foolish child," she said. "That's not your cat. It's only the morning sun shining on the chimney. Now pick up your feet and keep up with us." On they trudged deep into the woods, but all the while Hansel secretly dropped his little white stones. When we came to a part of the forest where we had never been before, the woodcutter built a fire, and his wife told Hansel and I to lie down, warm themselves, and rest. She said, "We are going into the forest to chop wood, and when we're finished, we'll come back to get you." Hansel and I sat by the fire as we had been told to do, and around noon we ate bread. All day we could hear the comforting sound of an axe chopping wood, and believed that Father was near. Soon we fell asleep. The sound we heard, though, was not an axe, but instead a sapling cleverly tied by their stepmother so as to thump against a hollow tree with every little breeze, sounding to all who heard it like chopping. When the little pair awoke, it was pitch dark, and the fire was but glowing embers. I began to fret and cry, pleading to Hansel, "How will we ever get home?" He replied confidently, "We will wait. When the moon rises high, I'm sure we'll make our way." And soon the moon did rise, and taking each other by the hand, we began making our way back home. In the glow of the moon, the pebbles shone like tiny beacons, and after a long night of walking at sunrise, Hansel and I arrived back on our cottage doorstep. We knocked on the door to be let in, and when their astonished stepmother swung the door open and saw us, she snarled at us, "You wicked children, why did you sleep so long in the forest? We thought you would never come back again." When our father saw us, though, he was overjoyed, for he had never wanted to abandon his precious children. For a time after this, life was better, and food seemed more plentiful. The family's worries eased for a while, but soon enough another famine ravaged the countryside. The woodcutter's family was once again starving. Just as before, late at night, when everyone was in their beds, Hansel and I lay awake, listening to our father and stepmother talking. "All our food is gone," the stepmother said. "All we have left is a loaf of bread. When that is gone, we will have nothing. This time, we need to take the children farther into the forest, so far that they'll never find their way home again. Otherwise, it will be the end of us all." Hearing this again from his wife saddened our father, for he thought it would be best to share his last bite with his children. His wife, however, roughly scolded him for a fool, and continued her vicious tirade until at last the woodcutter found himself agreeing to her cruel plan for a second time. Once again, after everyone had finally fallen asleep, Hansel rose from his bed, planning to slip out to the cottage yard and collect more white pebbles. However, this time, to his surprise, he found the door locked tight. He was unable to get out. Nevertheless, he confidently told me his little sister, who was crying softly into my pillow, "All will be right. We will never be forsaken." Early the next morning, Hansel and I were roused from our beds and given a chunk of bread for our noon meal. Along the way into the woods, Hansel would stop and drop a crumb of his bread to mark the trail. "Hansel, why are you stopping?" shouted his father. "Keep going!" "Oh, I am looking at my little pigeon perched on our cottage roof, father. He wants to say good-bye to me," said Hansel. "You fool," said his stepmother. "That is only the sun shining on the chimney." Nevertheless, little by little, Hansel managed to sprinkle crumbs along their path. Just as before, Hansel and I were led far, far into the forest, to a place we never imagined existed. A fire was lit, and the old woman cooed Hansel and I, "Rest here before the fire, and when the day is done we will be back to fetch you." Along about midday, I shared my bread with Hansel, who had used his to mark the path. Before long, the cool air, the warm fire, and a little something to eat made the two of us sleep. When we woke, it was dark, and we quickly understood that no one had come for us again. There we are in the forest, our stepmother and father leaving us. Hansel comforted me, saying, "We need only wait till the moon rises, just as before, little sister. Then we'll follow our trail of breadcrumbs back home. All will be well, don't worry." When the moon rose, however, no crumbs were to be found anywhere, and Hansel and I soon realized that the birds and animals that live in the forest had happily eaten all our bread. "Don't fret, we'll find our way," said Hansel, a little less certain than before. But try as we might, we could not find any of the familiar landmarks that might show us the way home. On the two of us walked throughout the night and all the next day. We were still no closer to home, though, and by now we were so very hungry, and our legs were so very tired, that all we could do was lie down on the mossy ground and sleep. On the third morning of their sad adventure, Hansel and I were ready to give up all hope, when we saw a beautiful snow-white bird sitting on a branch. The bird sang such a sweet song and was so beautiful that we agreed to follow it as it flew away. Into the forest the bird lured them until suddenly they came to a large clearing. In the middle of the clearing, to our astonishment, was a beautiful gingerbread house, complete with sugar crystal windows and decorated with candy treats and frosting. Oh, look at that! Doesn't it just look delicious? "What a blessed meal," said Hansel. "Let's have a taste. I'll try some delicious candy cane decorations. Gretel, you have some of the sugar crystal window. It looks so very sweet and tasty." And that is just what we did. And who can blame us, since we were both starving? Hansel broke off a piece of the gingerbread, and Gretel began nibbling on the window panes, when suddenly we heard a sharp voice cry out from within the house. "Nibble, nibble, I hear a mouse. Who's nibbling on my house?" We answered back, "'Tis the wind. The wind, it's very mild, blowing like a child." The two of us continued to enjoy the feast, as we were so hungry, and the house tasted ever so good. Hansel pulled down another large chunk of candy cane, and Gretel cracked out a large piece of sugar crystal and ate it with delight. Suddenly, the door of the house opened, and a very old woman, leaning on a crutch, came slinking from within. Hansel and I, quite naturally, were so frightened that we both dropped what we were eating. "Oh, you poor dear children! What has brought you here, I wonder? Won't you come inside and stay with me? No one is going to harm you," the old woman said sweetly. Then she led both of us by the hand into her house, where she served us a fine meal of pancakes, apples, milk, and nuts. Afterward, she made up 2 beds with fine white sheets, whereupon Hansel and I lay down and were soon asleep. She really did have such a beautiful home. In truth, though, the old woman was wicked and only pretended to be nice. She was, in fact, an evil, nasty witch, always on the lookout for little lost children. She had built her clever gingerbread house to lure boys and girls, and as soon as she had the poor lost children in her power, the evil old thing would cook and eat them. Now, this old witch had poor eyesight and had trouble making her way about, but she more than made up for this with an animal-like ability to smell. She had known from scenting the wind that Hansel and I were near long before we saw her house, and so had plenty of time to prepare her trap. Early the next morning, hovering above us, we lay sleeping, and the old witch thought to herself, "What a tasty meal these two would make." Quickly she grabbed Hansel in her bony hands and carried him away to a special pen with a locking door. He screamed and yelled, but it didn't matter, for she was surprisingly powerful and heartless. The old hag then went back and shook me awake, screeching at me, "Get up, you lazy bones, get up! You need to fetch water to cook your brother something nice to eat." Cackling, she said, "He's in my fattening pen, and when he's fat enough, I'm going to eat him." Poor me burst out with hot tears, but it was no use. She had to do what the witch commanded, or it would be the end of both of them, then and there. So for several days, the very best food was cooked for Hansel, while I got nothing but boiled crab shells. Yuck! Every morning, the old witch skulked over to the cage where she kept Hansel penned and shouted to him, "Hansel, stick out your finger so I can see how fat you've grown." However, Hansel was a bright boy and soon realized the old witch could not see very well. So, every morning he stuck out an old thin bone that he had found in his pen for the witch to inspect. The witch was fooled by the trick. In fact, she was puzzled over why Hansel didn't seem to fatten up. After a month had passed, and Hansel appeared no fatter than the day she put him in the pen, the evil old witch flew into a rage and decided to wait no longer. "Gretel," she cackled, "get me some wood for the fire. Fat or thin, Hansel is going to be my supper feast." Oh, how I wailed and cried as I carried buckets of water and armloads of wood for a cooking fire. "If only the wild beasts in the forest had gotten us," I cried, "then we could have been dead together." First, though, "We'll bake bread," barked the old witch. "Already I have heated the oven and kneaded the dough." All the while she was saying this, she was gently coaxing me toward the oven, where hot flames danced from the fire within. "Now, Gretel," the old witch sweetly murmured, "dear girl, you crawl inside and see the oven is properly warmed." Of course, the old hag intended to slam the oven door on me and cook me too. Sensing what the evil old thing was up to, I pretended not to understand what the witch wanted. I said, "How pleased am I to do what you ask? I am just a small girl and don't know how to get into an oven." "You foolish goose," the old woman snapped. "It's simple enough. Watch, even an old woman like me can climb in." And with that, she waddled to the oven, leaned into it, and quick as a wink and with all of her might, Gretel gave the witch a mighty shove, sending the hag tumbling headlong into the fire. With a bang, Gretel slammed the iron doors shut and bolted them tight, whereupon a great plume of black, oily smoke and terrible howls rose up from the chimney. I ran straight to Hansel, shouting, "The witch is gone! The old hag is cooked to death and will bother us no more!" With that, I unlocked Hansel's pen, and out he popped, hugging and kissing me as we both danced about the yard, shouting, "We're free! We're free! The wicked old witch is dead!" Now that the witch was gone, they had nothing to fear from her. So Hansel and I went to the witch's house and found what we suspected, witch's treasure. Gold, pearls, rubies, emeralds, and diamonds overflowing from her hoard of treasure chests. "These are much better than pebbles," said a grinning Hansel as he filled his pockets with treasure, and Gretel, too, stuffed her pockets with dazzling jewels. I did, I must admit. Later, our pockets were brimming with jewels, and having eaten their fill from the witch's pantry, Hansel and I decided it was time to get out of the witch's forest, and we began to find our way home. When we came to a broad river that seemed to offer no way across, Hansel said, "I cannot see any bridges or boats that might take us to the other side." "Don't worry, Hansel," I said. "Look, there is an elegant white duck swimming over there. She's bound to help us if only we ask her." So Gretel sweetly called out, help us, beautiful duck! We are Hansel and Gretel and out of luck. We can't get across the river, try as we may. Won't you please help us this fine day?" Sure enough, the kind and handsome duck swam over to us and carried each of us to the other side of the river, whereupon I gave the duck a generous piece of gingerbread from the witch's house. I had no idea that ducks loved gingerbread so much. The little travelers walked on for 2 more days, till suddenly the forest and land became more and more familiar, and to our amazement, late one afternoon, we caught sight of our own cottage. Hansel and I began to run, and before long we burst through the cottage door and threw ourselves about our father with hugs and kisses. The overjoyed woodcutter had not had a single happy minute since leaving his children in the woods, and in the meanwhile his wife had died from what the doctor declared to be a black heart. Upon hearing this news, I shook out my apron and let loose all the riches it held. And Hansel emptied his pockets of treasure, tossing it before our astonished father. Our troubles were at last over. Now, with our new-found good fortune and the love of each other, the woodcutter and his children lived out the rest of their lives in happiness and peace. Now, like a mouse caught by a cat, my tale is finished. Sleep well tonight, and don't let this old story give you a fright. Your parents love you dear, and will never let harm come near. Wasn't that wonderful? Looks like that's all the time we're going to have for the story today. I was so happy you came and joined me for me to share my story, and I hope you really liked it, as well as the beautiful illustrations in this book, adapted by Will Moses. I hope to see you next week, or maybe one of my friends will come and visit the library and share some of their stories with you. I hope you enjoyed this telling of Hansel and Gretel by me, Gretel, and I hope that I can see you soon, and be sure to stay safe. And I'll make sure that I say hello from some of my other friends who come and visit in the following weeks. Thank you so much for having me, and I hope to see you soon. Bye-bye!